Imagine you're standing before an immense sea, with the horizon stretching beyond what your eyes can take in. It's night, the air is cool, and the sound of the waves blends with the murmur of the wind. This is no ordinary night. It is the beginning of a journey, one that will lead us to seek the most famous lost city in history, Atlantis. Before we continue, tell me from which part of the world and at what time you're joining us tonight. I'd love to read you in the comments and feel that we're exploring this mystery together. Our story begins with a philosopher, but not just any philosopher, one of the most influential in Western civilization, Plato. His dialogues have shaped the way we understand concepts like justice, politics, and the organization of societies. Among those texts, which have survived for more than 2 millennia, 2 stand out for presenting an unusual account: the Timaeus and the Critias. Amid discussions about the origin of the universe and the order of cities, Plato introduces the tale of an advanced civilization that is said to have existed thousands of years before his time, and that, quite suddenly, was swallowed by the sea over the course of a single day and a single night. If you close your eyes for a moment, you can picture the scene: a group of disciples seated in 4th century Athens, attentive to their teacher's words. Plato describes a majestic city, formed by concentric rings of land and water, with harbors full of ships and temples of shining metal that reflected the light of dawn. The philosopher claims that this story was passed down in his family by the lawgiver Solon, who supposedly heard it from Egyptian priests during his journey to the Nile. That detail, the idea of an ancestral memory arriving from remote times, gives the tale a sense of plausibility that has intrigued entire generations. But the most powerful part of his narration is not only the description of its splendor, but the account of its fall. Atlantis, says Plato, became so powerful that its ambition led it to challenge the free peoples of the region and attempt to dominate the known world. Then, as a divine punishment, came earthquakes, floods, and finally the sinking of the island. In a single night, the great city vanished forever beneath the waters. Thus, the account is not merely a chronicle of a lost civilization, but also a warning about the dangers of pride and arrogance. That balance between myth, philosophy, and tragedy is what has kept the legend alive to this day. For some, it is a parable invented by Plato to explain the downfall of societies that forget virtue. For others, it is the memory of a real historical event, a recollection of a civilization that existed and was destroyed by a natural catastrophe. What is certain is that, for centuries, explorers, scholars, and adventurers have searched for its remains on maps, in coastal ruins, and on the ocean floor. Tonight, we will follow that same path, tracing the footprints left by philosophers, sailors, and scientists who have tried to solve this enigma. We will delve into theories, visit the places where some believe the island may have stood, and try to listen to the voices of a past that perhaps never existed, or perhaps is still waiting for us beneath the waters. The sea is still there, immense and serene, guarding its secrets. And as we contemplate it, it's easy to imagine that somewhere under those waves, the echo of that vanished city still resounds. It is time to begin following the thread of this story, which will take us further and further back in time. To understand the origin of this story, we must return to Athens 24 centuries ago, a city in full intellectual ferment, where temples, squares, and gymnasiums were stages for debate on the great matters of life. In that context, Plato, already mature and renowned, decides to write 2 very singular dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias. Both texts are part of a series that aim to explain not only the nature of the cosmos, but also the organization of human societies and the place that virtue occupies in the life of cities. It is in those pages that we find, for the first time, the mention of Atlantis. Plato presents the story as a truthful account transmitted across generations. According to him, the Athenian sage Solon considered one of the 7 sages of Greece, traveled to Egypt around the 6th century BCE. There, in the city of Sais, he met with priests who spoke to him about a war that had occurred thousands of years earlier between a powerful island located beyond the Pillars of Heracles and the ancient Athenians. That island was an extraordinary naval power, rich in resources and ruled by kings descended from the very god Poseidon. Plato's narration does not stop at merely mentioning this civilization. It offers striking details. He describes a city formed by concentric rings of land and sea, connected by bridges and canals. He speaks of walls clad in orichalcum, a mythical metal more precious than gold, and of temples dedicated to the gods that gleamed at dawn. The island's capital housed a central palace surrounded by gardens, sanctuaries, and barracks, with a harbor capable of receiving innumerable ships. Poseidon himself was said to have protected this city, granting it prosperity and strength, until corruption and the desire to conquer the entire world brought about its punishment. The most interesting aspect of this part of the account is how Plato interweaves myth and philosophy. For him, the story of Atlantis serves to illustrate the idea that societies flourish when they respect justice and balance, but fall into ruin when they yield to greed and unbridled power. The destruction of the island is not a simple cataclysm, but a moral lesson. It is a reminder that even the most advanced civilizations can disappear if they forget the virtue that sustains them. The way Plato introduces this story is so serious that it is hard to think it a mere tale. He does not present it as a popular myth, but as a fact transmitted by a tradition worthy of respect. This has led many researchers, even in modern times, to wonder whether the philosopher might have had access to real historical reports about catastrophes at the end of the last glaciation, when sea levels rose drastically and many coastal communities disappeared beneath the water. However, it must be remembered that Plato was, above all, a thinker. His work is full of allegories designed to invite reflection. Atlantis may have been for him a pedagogical tool, an extreme example to show how the hubris of a nation leads to its self-destruction. In fact, the dialogue Critias was left unfinished, interrupted in mid-sentence, as if Plato had left the story suspended so that the reader might ponder its deeper meaning. It is fascinating to picture the scene. A group of disciples, perhaps Aristotle among them, listening as Plato, in a measured voice, recounts the splendor and fall of a vanished civilization. The fire from the lamps illuminates the walls of the academy, and the distant murmur of Athens drifts in from the streets. For those who heard him, it was not simply a myth. It was a call to examine the conduct of their own city, an invitation not to repeat the errors of those kings who would defy the gods. Today, more than 2 millennia later, that same narration still awakens the same mix of wonder and doubt. Was it a memory of events that occurred in a remote past, or merely a literary experiment to speak of politics and morality? That ambiguity is perhaps what has kept the legend alive. Had Plato written a fantasy tale with no greater significance, it would likely have been lost among thousands of ancient stories. But by giving it a solemn tone and presenting it as a respectable tradition, he turned it into an enigma that still addresses us. Thus, the seed was planted. The idea that there once existed a great civilization destroyed by its own ambition. That seed would travel across the centuries, inspiring thinkers, explorers, and adventurers who would try to place that lost site on a map. And it is at this point that our search begins to expand beyond Plato's words, entering the attempts of humanity to find proof that his story might have been real. When Plato describes Atlantis, he does not do so with the brevity of someone mentioning a legend in passing. He takes us, almost by the hand, to walk its avenues, to behold its temples, and to hear the bustle of its ports. The island, he says, was larger than Libya and Asia Minor together, a fertile land that held every kind of resource. Its inhabitants lived in abundance, thanks to irrigation canals that carried water from the mountains to the fields. Its cities were built with geometric precision, as if an ordering mind had drawn every street and every ring of land with compass and ruler. The heart of the capital was a complex of 3 rings of land separated by rings of sea, linked to one another by bridges. There stood the Temple of Poseidon, made of orichalcum, a bright reddish metal so rare that even in Plato's time it was scarcely known. Its walls were coated in this material, so that at dawn the sunlight made it blaze as if it were on fire. Inside the temple stood the statue of the god, mounted on a chariot drawn by winged horses and surrounded by 100 nereids, all sculpted with a realism that must have impressed any visitor. Plato also tells us about Atlantis's political system, a monarchy ruled by 10 kings, descendants of the 10 sons Poseidon had with a mortal named Plato. Each king governed a part of the island, but all met periodically in the temple to discuss common affairs, offer sacrifices, and enact laws. It was a society that seemed balanced, prosperous, and organized, almost a political ideal. It is no accident that Plato, in his philosophy, always sought the idea of the just and orderly city. In his description of Atlantis, there seems to be a reflection of that dream, though soon the tale will turn into a warning. For not everything was harmony. Over time, the Atlanteans, who had been just and moderate, let themselves be seduced by power. They expanded beyond their island, conquered other lands, and came to threaten even primitive Athens. It was then that, according to the account, the Athenians rose to defend the freedom of the known world and defeated the mighty Atlantean Empire. This detail is fundamental. Plato, who loved his city, presents the Athenians as the heroes who stood against a much greater power. It is a way of showing the triumph of virtue and civic valor over arrogance. And then, the tragedy. The gods, angered by the corruption of the Atlanteans, unleashed their punishment. Earthquakes and storms lashed the island. Temples collapsed. The waters rose until they covered everything. In a single night, that great civilization fell silent beneath the ocean. Plato gives no further details. He simply states that the island disappeared, and that the sea where it had been became unnavigable, filled with shoals of mud. That final phrase has extraordinary poetic force. A city so resplendent turned to mire, erased from the map as if it had never existed. Hearing this story in full must have stirred a mix of emotions in Plato's listeners. On the one hand, wonder at such a perfect city. On the other, the unease of knowing that even the mightiest civilizations can vanish in an instant. That sense of fragility is what has kept the story alive, because it speaks to something profoundly human, the awareness that no power is eternal. As we delve into this narration, it is inevitable to ask, was Plato describing a historical memory, transmitted across generations, or crafting a symbolic account to teach a moral lesson? That doubt has driven centuries of speculation, and perhaps it is precisely that ambiguity which urges us to keep searching, as if we wanted to verify for ourselves whether, on the ocean floor, the confirmation of his words lies hidden. With the image of this resplendent city still in mind, the journey undertaken by later explorers becomes easier to understand. They sought not only archaeological remains, but also the possibility that this tale was something more than a fable. And there, in that impulse to find tangible proof, the next stage of our voyage begins. The story of Atlantis did not lie dormant in Plato's scrolls. Over the centuries, each era took it up with the astonishment of one who discovers an ancient secret. During the Middle Ages, the legend remained almost hidden, remembered only by a few scholars who kept copies of the Greek dialogues. But everything changed with the Renaissance. Europe was beginning to rediscover the classical world, to read the philosophers again in their original language, and to open itself to unknown horizons. Libraries filled with recovered manuscripts, scholars debated in Latin and Greek, and curiosity about the past mingled with the excitement of new geographical discoveries. It was then that the myth of Atlantis awoke once more. Cartographers and chroniclers began to ask whether the new lands found in the Atlantic Ocean might be the remains of that lost island. It is no coincidence that Christopher Columbus, upon returning from his first voyage in 1493, mentioned the possibility that the lands discovered beyond the sea could be connected to ancient accounts. The imagination of his time was alight. If there was an entire continent hidden from Europeans, why could there not also have been a great island that disappeared beneath the waters? The maps of the period reflect this fervor. Some show mysterious islands in the middle of the Atlantic, at times called Antillia or Brazil, that appeared and disappeared from records depending on the cartographer. Even on the cartography of Piri Reis, the famous 16th century Ottoman admiral, coasts are depicted that many have interpreted as vestiges of ancient lands now submerged. The legend of Atlantis seemed to fit perfectly into this new world of exploration, a reminder that the ocean could harbor secrets even more astonishing than those already revealed. In parallel, philosophers and theologians began to reflect on what this tale might mean for understanding human history. Francis Bacon, in the 17th century, wrote his work, The New Atlantis, where he describes a utopian island devoted to knowledge and science. Although his intention was not to assert the real existence of Atlantis, his account shows how deeply the myth had taken root in the thinker's imagination. For Bacon, the island was a symbol of progress, a beacon of hope for a Europe beginning to leave the Middle Ages behind. But it wasn't all literary speculation. Some explorers and adventurers truly believed they might find physical remains of Atlantis. Sailors' reports spoke of strange stones on the ocean floor, of submerged columns seen through the clear waters of the Caribbean, of coral cities that looked like ruins. Most of these testimonies were hard to verify, but they fueled the desire to keep searching. In the 19th century, with the rise of archaeology and the systematic study of ancient civilizations, interest in the topic intensified even more. One of the most important drivers of this fever was Ignatius Donnelly, a U.S. congressman and writer who in 1882 published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. In this book, Donnelly gathered all kinds of data, from linguistic comparisons to archaeological findings, to argue that Atlantis had been a real civilization and that its disappearance had left traces in cultures around the world. His work was a resounding success and popularized the idea that beneath the ocean might lie the cradle of civilized humanity. Although most of his theories have been questioned or dismissed by modern science, his enthusiasm marked the beginning of a movement that remains alive today. This period of rediscovery turned Atlantis into more than a philosophical myth. It became an object of exploration, a dream of scientific discovery, and, at the same time, a metaphor for a lost paradise. Each generation projected its own longings onto it. For some, it was proof that there had been civilizations more advanced than ours. For others, a warning that greatness can vanish from one day to the next. As the centuries passed, the ocean ceased to be a limit and became a promise. There, beneath the waters, perhaps lie the answers to one of humanity's most fascinating enigmas. And it is in this spirit of quest that a new chapter enters the story. That of modern hypotheses striving to locate Atlantis in a specific place on the map. If anything has kept the legend of Atlantis alive, it's the wide variety of theories about where it might have been. Each generation has wanted to place it in a different spot, and each researcher has tried to fit Plato's account to the landscapes they knew best. The result is a mosaic of hypotheses that spreads to every corner of the planet, from the Mediterranean to the far reaches of the Atlantic and beyond. One of the theories most accepted by archaeologists places Atlantis in the Aegean Sea, around the island of Santorini, also known as Thera. There, about 3,600 years ago, a colossal volcanic eruption destroyed much of the island and unleashed tsunamis that ravaged nearby coasts. The remains of the Minoan civilization, found in Crete and on Santorini itself, reveal a people advanced in architecture, art, and seafaring, whose cities were abruptly abandoned after the disaster. For many, This could be the historical nucleus that inspired Plato, even if his account sets the events thousands of years earlier and on a much larger territory. But not everyone is content with this Mediterranean explanation. Since the 19th century, eyes have also turned to the Atlantic. The Azores, in the middle of the ocean, have been proposed as the last vestiges of Atlantis, survivors of a larger continental mass that supposedly sank. The idea is enticing, to imagine that those emergent mountains are in fact the peaks of a submerged land. However, modern geology has shown that the Azores are volcanic in origin and not remnants of a lost continent, which hasn't stopped the theory from fueling popular imagination. Further south, the Caribbean has become another recurring candidate. There, in the Bahamas, lies the so-called Bimini Road, a submerged rock formation that some have interpreted as the remains of an ancient paved roadway. Scientists have explained that it's a natural phenomenon, the product of limestone slabs fracturing, but for enthusiasts of Atlantis, it remains a tempting clue. The clarity of Caribbean waters has given rise to stories of submerged columns, stone pyramids, and mysterious ruins, many of them still unconfirmed. In the 20th century, even bolder proposals emerged. Some researchers have suggested that Atlantis could have been located on the American continent, linking Plato's account with Mesoamerican cultures, while others have posited that it might have been in the South Atlantic or even Antarctica, beneath the ice. This last theory, though highly controversial, holds that the Earth's crust may have shifted thousands of years ago, moving a continent from a more temperate zone to the South Pole, which would have buried its civilization under glaciers. Although most geologists dismiss such a drastic shift in so short a time, the image of a city entombed beneath the ice has inspired novels, documentaries, and films. All these hypotheses share something in common: a fascination with a lost past. Every time a submerged structure is found or an old map turns up with strange shapes, the possibility that it might be Atlantis reignites the debate. It's not just the desire to solve a historical mystery, but also the yearning to discover that humanity, in a remote past, had a distant relative capable of feats as extraordinary as ours, or even greater. It's interesting to reflect on what drives us to keep searching. Perhaps it's not only about finding a sunken city, but about confirming that the story of humanity is older, richer, and more astonishing than we believe. Atlantis then becomes a mirror, where we project our doubts and our hopes. If an advanced civilization once existed that fell from grace, could we be walking the same path? With all these hypotheses on the table, the next step is to plunge, almost literally, into the places where the ocean might be hiding clues. There, among corals, sands, and the remnants of ancient coastlines, we may find something that brings us a little closer to the truth. For those who have set out to search for Atlantis, there is no place more tempting than the seafloor. Since the mid-20th century, when diving and underwater exploration techniques began to advance, the quest ceased to be an exercise in imagination and became a concrete endeavor. The first explorers hurled themselves into the ocean with rudimentary diving suits and underwater cameras, trying to find something that could confirm Plato's words. The sea became a great silent archive, a place where every rock could be a vestige and every shadow a clue. In the Caribbean, the clarity of the waters has allowed the discovery of formations that for decades fed the mystery. One of the most famous is the so-called Bimini Road, found in 1968 by divers who identified what looked like a paved roadway under the water. The rectangular slabs, laid out in a line, gave the impression of a causeway built by human hands. Although geologists have explained that these formations are due to natural processes of fracture in limestone, for defenders of the Atlantean theory, it was proof that something very ancient lies there, just a few meters below the surface. Thousands of kilometers away in Japan, another find sparked similar excitement. Off the island of Yonaguni, in the Okinawa archipelago, huge submerged structures shaped like terraces and steps were discovered in 1986. Some researchers have proposed that they are the remains of a city that sank more than 10,000 years ago, while others insist they are natural formations sculpted by ocean currents. The debate continues, but the images of those gigantic stone platforms, carpeted in algae, seem to come from a dream. Technology has opened new possibilities. Today, oceanographers use side-scan sonar, remotely operated vehicles, and high-definition cameras to explore ocean regions that were once inaccessible. These tools have revealed astonishing landscapes, underwater mountains, abyssal plains, and the remnants of ancient shorelines now hundreds of meters deep. In some cases, structures reminiscent of walls or pavements have been found, rekindling speculation about submerged cities. Though science remains cautious, the mere possibility that there are real ruins beneath the sea keeps the passion for searching alive. Beyond concrete discoveries, there is an emotional element to these explorations. Divers who descend into the depths often describe a sense of reverence, as if entering a sanctuary. The light dims, sounds grow distant, and suddenly a formation appears that seems to have been touched by human ingenuity. That experience, a blend of science and adventure, is what has inspired documentaries, novels, and films that recreate entire cities beneath the ocean. Of course, not all searches have been fruitful. Fortunes have been spent on expeditions that returned empty-handed. And yet each failure seems to fuel the desire to keep trying, as if Atlantis had become a personal promise for those who seek it. After all, who wouldn't want to be the first to behold the streets of a city that has slept for thousands of years under the waves? The truth is that, although no conclusive proof of Atlantis has been found to date, underwater explorations have revealed an undeniable fact. Sea level has changed drastically since the end of the last glaciation, about 12,000 years ago. Vast stretches of land that were once habitable are now submerged, which means that legends about lost cities may hold more truth than we imagine. That realization leads us to look at the past with different eyes. If the sea has been capable of covering entire continents, then Plato's account stops sounding so improbable. Perhaps we need not imagine a single mythical island, but many vanished coastal cities whose memories merged into one myth. And that idea brings us to the next step in our journey, exploring the great natural catastrophes that could have given rise to a legend that has endured for more than 2 millennia. When we think about the disappearance of Atlantis, Plato's account speaks of a sudden cataclysm, earthquakes, storms, and a raging sea that, in a single night, devoured the entire island. It may sound like a fable, but Earth's geological history shows that catastrophes of that magnitude are not only possible, they have occurred on several occasions throughout prehistory. Understanding these events is essential to place the myth in context. Perhaps Plato, or the sources he cites, were recalling a real disaster that became etched in the memory of ancient peoples. About 12,000 years ago, the last glaciation ended. For tens of millennia, much of the planet had been covered by enormous ice sheets, so thick that they pressed the ground beneath their weight. When the climate began to warm, those glaciers melted, releasing immense quantities of fresh water that caused a global sea level rise of more than 100 meters. This means that vast coastal regions were submerged. Fertile plains, deltas, villages of hunter-gatherers, and probably humanity's earliest port cities disappeared beneath the waves. This process was not always slow and gradual. Geology has identified episodes of accelerated melt, such as the so-called meltwater pulse 1A, when in just a few centuries, perhaps even in decades, the sea rose abruptly. For communities living near the coast, these changes must have been devastating. Entire villages flooded, hunting and fishing routes altered, sacred territories lost forever. It's not hard to imagine that, passed down from generation to generation, these stories turned into accounts of great deluges and divine punishments. Beyond flooding, the geological record shows evidence of gigantic tsunamis. In the North Atlantic, for example, traces have been found of the so-called Storega slide, a submarine collapse that occurred about 8,000 years ago and generated a tsunami that laid waste to the coasts of Norway, Scotland, and the North Sea. The sediment layers left by this event suggest waves tens of meters high that penetrated deep inland. For the peoples who inhabited those lands, it must have seemed like the end of the world. In other parts of the planet, volcanic eruptions left scars just as dramatic. The explosion of Thera in the Aegean was so powerful that it may have inspired myths of destruction across the Mediterranean region. The sky darkened for weeks, harvests failed, and tsunamis struck Crete's shores. For the survivors, it was not merely a natural phenomenon. It was a punishment from the gods. And we cannot forget earthquakes, capable of leveling cities in a matter of seconds. In the Mediterranean, seismic faults have erased entire harbors and sunk parts of islands, as happened at Helike, the Greek city that collapsed beneath the sea in the 4th century BCE, precisely in Plato's time. These examples show that human memory has ample reason to remember water as a force capable of destroying civilizations. And this is where the legend of Atlantis takes on another dimension. Perhaps it is not a single island, but the sum of multiple memories of catastrophes that occurred in different places and times, combined into one powerful tale that warned of the fragility of human life before the forces of nature. It's impossible not to wonder what we would feel if suddenly we saw our own city vanish beneath the ocean. Could our collective memory transform that horror into a myth that endured for thousands of years? Perhaps that is exactly what ancient peoples did, passing down the memory of what they had lost until it reached the ears of Greek philosophers. This look into the past leaves us with an unease. If the world has already witnessed such catastrophes, what other secrets might remain hidden beneath the sea, waiting to be found? That question is what drives archaeologists and scientists to keep searching, combining the study of myths with the most advanced technology. And so, with the certainty that the planet has changed radically since Plato's day, we take the next step to discover what current science thinks about the possibility that Atlantis was something more than a philosophical myth. As the myth of Atlantis grew, so did the interest in subjecting it to the scrutiny of reason. Since the birth of modern archaeology in the 19th century, many researchers have tried to separate the wheat from the chaff and determine whether there is a historical core to Plato's narrative, or whether it is merely a literary exercise. For some historians, the answer is clear. Plato invented the story to illustrate a moral lesson, and searching for Atlantis in the real world would be as pointless as trying to find the cave from his famous allegory. This point of view is supported by the philosopher's own work. Plato was deeply concerned with social order and how communities could attain justice. In his dialogues, it was not unusual for him to construct hypothetical tales to present his ideas, and some specialists interpret Atlantis as a kind of parable that allowed him to show the difference between a society that becomes corrupt and one that remains faithful to virtue. In this sense, the Atlanteans would be the negative example, the mirror in which Athens should not see itself. Even so, other researchers have preferred to keep the door open to the possibility that Plato was recounting a real event, albeit embellished or transformed by time. This group includes archaeologists who study the remains of submerged cities and geologists who investigate changes in sea level. For them, the account could contain elements of an oral tradition reaching back to catastrophes at the end of the last glaciation. Thus, what Plato called Atlantis would not necessarily be a single island, but the sum of memories of several vanished coastal cities. In the 20th and 21st centuries, investigations have become more systematic. Universities and research centers have used techniques such as sonar mapping and satellite remote sensing to search for structures on the ocean floor. In some cases, they have found remains of prehistoric settlements underwater, especially in areas of the Mediterranean and the North Sea. These findings confirm that many human communities ended up beneath the water when sea levels rose, but so far no conclusive evidence has been found of a great vanished civilization of the magnitude Plato describes. This contrast between myth and science produces a curious effect. While tangible evidence remains elusive, popular interest only grows. Documentaries, novels, and television programs explore every new clue, even though scientific conclusions are often cautious. In part, this is because the myth holds enormous narrative power. The idea that an entire city might be waiting to be discovered on the seafloor is too seductive to let go. The tension between skepticism and fascination has produced a peculiar balance. On the one hand, the most rigorous researchers warn that we should not read ancient texts as if they were newspaper reports. On the other, they acknowledge that curiosity about the secrets of the past has led to important advances in archaeology and marine geology. In the end, even the search for something that may never have existed has served to broaden our knowledge of humanity's early history. That is perhaps the most interesting paradox of Atlantis, that even if we never find its ruins, its legend has spurred real explorations, theories, and discoveries. And at this point, the story opens again onto the terrain of cultures and myths from around the world, because the idea of a great flood or a lost city does not belong only to the Greeks. It appears in traditions as diverse as those of Mesopotamia, the Americas, and Oceania. With that door open to a universe of parallel tales, our journey continues, following the echo of other ancient voices that also spoke of sunken worlds. The story of a great flood that wipes out entire cities and towns is not exclusive to the Greek tradition. In fact, it is one of humanity's most universal tales. Almost every culture in the world preserves some version of a primordial deluge, a devastating event that ends one era and begins another. This suggests that, beyond literary fiction, there may have been a collective memory of catastrophes that profoundly marked prehistoric communities. In Mesopotamia, cradle of some of the first civilizations, we find the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest known texts. There appears the tale of Utnapishtim, a man who receives the god's command to build a great boat to save his family and the animals from a flood that would destroy humanity. This account, over 4,000 years old, presents notable parallels with the biblical story of Noah and the Ark. Both narratives describe the same sequence of destruction, salvation, and renewal, as if the flood were a kind of symbolic boundary between past and present. The cultures of India also speak of a great watery cataclysm. In the sacred text of the Shatapatha Brahmana, the sage Manu receives a warning from a divine fish, telling him that a great flood is coming. Manu builds a boat, saves himself along with other survivors, and then repopulates the earth. It is fascinating to note that this tale does not come after Plato, but is much older, which suggests that the memory of catastrophic floods was part of the traditions of many societies separated by thousands of kilometers. In the Americas, indigenous peoples also keep stories of seas that rose and devoured the land. The Maya spoke of the destruction of earlier eras in which the sky fell and the world was covered by waters, before the gods created a new humanity. In the Andean region, the Inca told the story of Unu Pachacuti, a great flood that swept away primitive humanity. Farther north, tribes of North America relate that their ancestors were saved by taking refuge in caves or mountains while the plains were submerged beneath a furious sea. Even in Oceania, the islands of the Pacific are full of legends about lands that sank and peoples who migrated in canoes to survive. For Polynesians, many islands were considered the remains of a larger continent, a mythical place of origin from which their ancestors came. These narratives are not mere coincidences. They reveal a shared memory of events that must have been terrifying and that over time became foundational myths. Considering all these stories together, the possibility arises that what we call Atlantis is not a single place, but a symbol that concentrates humanity's experience in the face of loss. Plato's sunken city could represent many cities, many villages, many cultures that saw their world crumble under the weight of earthquakes, eruptions, and rising seas. In some way, the myth turns that trauma into something intelligible. It is not just a natural catastrophe, it is a punishment for hubris, a lesson warning future generations. Reflecting on this point can be uncomfortable, It reminds us that our civilization, advanced as it may be, is not invulnerable. Like the Atlanteans, we have built ports, skyscrapers, and coastal cities that could be threatened if the sea rises again, as is already happening in some regions due to climate change. The stories of the past, far from being mere tales, seem to resound as warnings for the present. This vast chorus of accounts, from Mesopotamia to the Pacific, prepares us to take one more step. If so many cultures agree in speaking of lost worlds, perhaps it is time to try to imagine what it was like to live in one of them, to recreate in our minds what those who inhabited a city the sea claimed for itself might have seen. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine time rewinding thousands of years, carrying you to a majestic island in the heart of the ocean. You feel the salty air on your skin, warm and clean, as a golden sun rises over the horizon. Before you, the capital of Atlantis unfolds in all its magnificence. The water channels reflect the sky, and the stone avenues lead to a ceremonial center that glows as if made of fire. The sound of bells rings in the distance, marking the start of another day in a city that breathes power and harmony. You walk along a stone bridge that connects one of the outer rings with the heart of the city. On both sides, the water is so clear that you can see the anchored boats, their sails furled and their prows decorated with figures of mythical animals. In the air, the aromas of spices, fresh fish, and sea flowers mingle, because the market is in full swing. Men and women dressed in brightly colored tunics trade goods brought from distant lands. Ivories, precious metals, exotic woods, and unfamiliar fruits. The island is not an isolated place, but a commercial hub receiving goods from every direction of the known world. As you move toward the center, the buildings grow more imposing. The walls of the houses are decorated with mosaics that tell stories of battles, ceremonies, and naval triumphs. The sound of artisans working metal echoes from the workshops, where weapons, jewelry, and ritual objects are forged. It is said that the Atlanteans master orichalcum, a shining metal found nowhere else in the world, and that their temples are clad in it to honor the gods. You reach the heart of the city, the great temple of Poseidon. Its columns rise toward the sky, and inside one breathes a solemn silence, broken only by the murmur of water from the sacred fountains. At the center, the statue of the god, sculpted in gold and ivory, shows him driving a chariot pulled by horses, a symbol of his dominion over the sea. Priests and priestesses move with calm steps, carrying lit torches, while the faithful lay offerings of flowers, oil, and small metal objects. It is a place that combines political power and devotion, because in Atlantis, religion and government are deeply intertwined. The bustle swells again when you leave the temple and head toward the inner harbor. There you see ships ready to set sail, with crews checking sails and loading provisions. The air is full of shouts and orders, but also of laughter. The Atlanteans are consummate navigators and seem to relish each expedition. Their vessels are light, swift, and capable of crossing great distances. It is not hard to imagine that their naval might is the key to their dominion over other peoples. The day advances, and the sun begins to decline, tinting the sky in shades of orange and violet. From atop a terrace, you watch the city light up with hundreds of torches. The music of drums and flutes begins to sound. It is the hour of celebration. The inhabitants gather in the squares to share wine, tell stories, and pay homage to their gods. For a moment, it seems nothing could disturb the peace of this society that lives amid luxury, discipline, and devotion. But if you remain there in silence, listening carefully, it's possible to feel an underground current of unease. Some faces seem tense. Some conversations fall silent when you approach. Perhaps there are signs that the balance is about to break, that the splendor you have just witnessed stands on the threshold of its twilight. When the music stops and the lights begin to fade, the image of the city remains etched in your mind. Atlantis is alive, but something in the air suggests it won't be for long. And it is in that instant, in that calm before the storm, that the shadow of its fate begins to take shape. The calm that seemed eternal begins to crack. It is night, and in the capital of Atlantis the air is denser than usual. The sky, which at dusk gleamed in golden tones, has turned a deep black. The stars seem to have hidden, and a pale moon barely lights the streets and canals. Somewhere, far in the mountains, a muffled roar shakes the earth. At first it is only a slight tremor, something the inhabitants seem to ignore, accustomed to the ground's movements. But within minutes the vibration grows more intense, until the lamps sway, the water in the canals churns, and a strange silence seizes the city. Then the first blow comes. A deep thunder, as if the island itself split in two, shakes the temple's foundations. The bells ring without anyone touching them. Walls crack, and the ground opens in fissures that swallow columns and sculptures. The bustle of the markets turns into screams of panic. Families run into the streets trying to reunite, while priests raise prayers to the gods to halt the catastrophe. But the disaster seems unstoppable, as if the forces of nature had waited patiently to reclaim what is theirs. From the harbor, some ships try to set sail, but the sea is restless. The waters withdraw suddenly, exposing the seabed, a phenomenon many do not understand until it is too late. When the tide returns, it does so as a wall of water that slams into the docks, dragging vessels, houses, and people in the same torrent. The ocean's roar is deafening, and waves flood the streets of the outer rings, turning canals into furious currents that tear down everything in their path. Plato's accounts speak of a single day and a single night of misfortune, and it's easy to imagine the horror of those who lived it. The mountains spit fire and ash, staining the sky red, while the sea rises higher than anyone had ever seen. The temples, proud symbols of Atlantean prosperity, begin to collapse under the tremors. Statues shatter, torches fall, and palaces catch fire. The city that hours earlier shone with music and celebration now plunges into absolute chaos, lit only by the glow of flames and the lightning rending the sky. The survivors who manage to flee to higher ground watch as the island begins to sink. First the harbors, then the neighborhoods closest to the sea, then the squares and the temples. The spectacle is so overwhelming that some fall to their knees, convinced the gods have decided to end their people. Others try to escape in improvised boats, but the ocean grants no respite. The waves are too great, and one after another they pound the coasts, until scarcely any land remains in sight. At some point, everything ends. The roar of the water slowly fades and the sea regains its calm, as if nothing had happened. When dawn breaks, the island is gone. Where temples and gardens once stood, there is only the ocean, strewn with floating debris. Plato's account says the sea became unnavigable, full of banks of mud, and that image of desolation is perhaps the most powerful in the legend. An entire civilization erased in a matter of hours, as if history had decided to close a page and start anew. What remains afterward is silence. A silence that speaks louder than any word, because it is the silence of the irreparable, of what will not return. And yet, in that silence, the myth is also born. The memory that the survivors, if any there were, passed down and that centuries later would reach Greek ears. Perhaps this is the true power of the story of Atlantis, to turn tragedy into warning, disaster into lesson. When the last wave withdraws and the sea shines again under the sun, the only thing left is the question of what was truly lost that night. That question is the one that still resounds, and it is the one that invites us to reflect on the legacy of this mythical city and on what its disappearance can teach us today. When the sea calms again and the sun rises over the horizon, Atlantis is no more. but the void it leaves is so profound that it pierces the centuries. The vanished island becomes more than a memory. It turns into a symbol that each generation interprets in its own way. For Plato's Greeks, it was a warning against excessive ambition and the scorn for virtue. For Renaissance thinkers, it represented the promise of a lost world full of knowledge, a mirror in which to imagine new utopias. For us in the 21st century, it is an invitation to look at our present and ask whether we have learned anything from those lessons. Atlantis is, in a way, the first great global myth. Although its story is born in a Greek context, it has resonated across cultures on every continent, inspiring explorers, writers, and dreamers. It has given rise to novels, films, scientific investigations, and even alternative theories that blend history, geology, and fantasy. Its power does not lie in the chance that it may one day be found, though that possibility continues to fascinate many, but in its capacity to make us reflect on the fate of civilizations. Because at bottom, what intrigues us most about Atlantis is not its location, but its fall. It forces us to ask what can make a brilliant, powerful, and prosperous people collapse suddenly. Plato offers us an answer. Corruption, the loss of balance, ambition that grows beyond the reasonable. It is an idea still relevant today, when we see how the planet's resources are being depleted, how social tensions rise, and how our own technological creations can become threats if we do not know how to control them. Atlantis reminds us that no civilization is invincible, and that the true challenge is not to attain power, but to sustain it without destroying ourselves. At the same time, the legend awakens hope. It tells us that even what disappears can remain alive in memory, that stories can cross time to warn us, inspire us, and sometimes console us. If Atlantis existed, in some way it still exists every time someone imagines it. Every time an archaeologist dives in search of ruins, or a child dreams of crystal cities beneath the sea. And if it never existed, then its value is greater still, because it proves that the human imagination can create tales so powerful that they become part of history. Perhaps that is its true legacy, to remind us that civilizations are built not only with stone and metal, but also with ideas. When those ideas are just, they can outlast any temple. When they are corrupted, even the most splendid cities can crumble. Atlantis is at once warning and hope. Warning of what happens when we lose our balance, and hope that we can always rebuild what we have lost if we learn from our mistakes. The sea remains there, as unfathomable as ever, guarding its secrets in silence. Perhaps beneath its waters lie the ruins of the mythical city, or perhaps only the reflection of our own desire for transcendence. But as long as we keep asking about it, as long as its story continues to inspire searches and reflections, Atlantis will not be entirely lost. And with that thought, we leave the waves behind, carrying with us not only the image of a city that might have existed, but the certainty that its message remains alive, waiting to be heard by those willing to learn it. We have traveled together across ancient seas, walked through streets that may never have existed, and watched the ocean reclaim them forever. Perhaps Atlantis is a memory of something real, or perhaps a collective dream, but its story invites us to ask what traces we will leave behind. I would love to know what you felt on this journey. Rest now, and may the murmur of the sea accompany you tonight. Good night.